When winter falls over a mountain town, the world grows quiet. Snow covers every road, every rooftop, every forgotten story. But on one frozen evening, something moved in the drifting white. A dog, alone, injured, pulling himself forward with nothing but willpower and a spark of hope that refused to die. No one knew his name, no one knew where he came from. Yet the moment an officer stopped his truck and stepped into the storm, a chain of miracles began to unfold. This is the story of how a broken dog saved a town, and how a cold winter turned into a season of courage, love, and redemption. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. I would love to see your town in the comments. Winter had settled over the mountain town of Ash Falls like a great white shroud, soft yet merciless, turning every rooftop into a pale monument and every road into a quiet corridor of drifting snow. The season came early this year, sliding down from the jagged peaks like a memory the land could not shrug off. Winds moved through the pines with the long, low sigh of an old cathedral organ, and the sky hung heavy with 1,000 unfallen flakes waiting for their moment to descend. On the highway that curved around the outskirts of town, the world looked almost erased. No color, no sound, only the slow pulse of snowfall and the whisper of tires from the rare car that dared to travel the icy stretch. Along that highway, a small dark shape moved against the endless white. At first, it resembled a broken branch dragged by the wind, or a bundle of cloth left behind by some traveler. But as one came closer, the truth revealed itself. A German shepherd dog, young but worn by hardship, its golden black coat tangled into stiff knots, patches of frost clinging like brittle armor. The dog, later to be named Ranger, was roughly 3 years old, with strong bone structure and a broad chest that once carried the confidence of a trained working companion. But now his hind legs trailed helplessly behind him, leaving a thin, wavering line carved through the snow. His breaths came shallow and slow, forming small ghosts of vapor that curled upward before dissolving. Ranger had once been beautifully built for service, tall for his breed, with alert triangular ears and eyes the color of amber forged under a late summer sun. But in this moment, the eyes had dimmed, shadows of exhaustion clouding their warmth. Yet something remained, something steady, patient, stubborn in the quiet way survivors often are. He did not whine, did not panic. He simply crawled because crawling was what he had left. Several cars passed, their drivers glancing through fogged windows, hurried by the storm, pulled by worries of their own. No one stopped. The wind buried Ranger's tracks as fast as he could make them, as if the storm itself wished to erase him. Then a silver patrol truck rounded the bend, the red-blue light spinning faintly against the falling snow. Inside was Deputy Mason Hale, a 40-year-old sheriff's deputy with the frame of a man accustomed to long shifts, bitter mornings, and the kind of solitude that settles in after deep loss. Mason was tall, around 6'2", built strong but a bit worn around the edges. His dark brown hair, trimmed short out of habit more than style, carried threads of early gray near the temples. His eyes were slate blue, the color of a winter lake at dusk, still quiet, carrying things beneath the surface. 3 years ago, he had lost his wife in a winter road accident, a memory shaped by shattered headlights, metal on ice, and the kind of silence that followed him into every season. Since then, he had lived alone in a wooden cabin at the forest's edge, working his shifts, speaking little, and keeping his grief folded inside like a letter no one else was meant to read. As Mason drove, something flickered at the edge of his vision, a movement too deliberate to belong to nature. He slowed, squinting through the curtain of snow, and felt his breath catch when the headlights illuminated the struggling form of Ranger, dragging himself along the roadside. Mason parked quickly, stepped out into the biting cold, and the wind greeted him with a slap of frozen air. He approached the dog carefully, kneeling beside him. Up close, Ranger looked even worse. His fur was knotted with ice, his ribs faintly visible beneath the matted coat, and his hindquarters lay limp and motionless. Yet he lifted his head to meet Mason's gaze, not with fear or desperation, but with a calm acceptance that struck the deputy deeply. Many animals cried out when in pain, but this one seemed to confront suffering the same way the mountains confronted winter, quietly, without complaint. "Hey, buddy," Mason murmured, his voice low and steady. "You're not giving up out here, okay?" He scanned the dog's body with practiced eyes. Years as a deputy had taught him to assess injuries quickly. Ranger's front paws were raw from dragging himself, and faint old scars suggested prior surgeries, evidence of a dog once trained for serious work. Mason slipped his arms beneath Ranger's body and gently lifted him. The dog was heavier than expected, solid despite the cold. Ranger's head rested weakly against Mason's shoulder, but his gaze remained warm, as if he understood he had finally been seen. Mason carried Ranger to the truck, careful not to jostle him, and placed him on a blanket in the back seat. Snow fell harder, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. The drive into town was slow, the roads slick and the wind trying to push the truck sideways. Mason spoke softly as he drove, habit, maybe, or instinct, as though filling the silence kept Ranger tethered to consciousness. Ash Falls had one small veterinary clinic run by Dr. Linda Keating, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair, usually tied in a messy bun. She was short and sturdy, with a warm but no-nonsense personality formed by years of tending to farm animals, rescue pets, and the occasional stubborn horse. Her hands were steady, strong, and gentle, hands that had nursed the last cat of an old widower and delivered puppies for families who had little else to love. She greeted Mason at the door with the urgency of someone who understood the thin line between minutes that save and minutes that cost lives. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, pine wood, and wet fur. Mason laid Ranger on the exam table while Dr. Keating moved quickly, scanning the dog for ID tags before reaching for a microchip reader. The scanner beeped but returned. No registered data. Her brows furrowed. Most working dogs were microchipped, and service dogs almost always had complete records. She examined the old scars along Ranger's spine, precise lines that hinted at surgeries done by trained hands. He was somebody's partner, she said quietly. Someone put a lot of care into him. Mason nodded but said nothing. He watched Ranger's chest rise and fall, each breath slow but determined. Something in him stirred, an echo of the worry he once felt waiting beside hospital beds. But this time, the fear was gentler, smaller, something he could hold. Dr. Keating cleaned Ranger's paws, treated frostbite along his legs, checked his vitals, and inspected the hind legs. Finally, she looked up at Mason. His spine was injured a long time ago, not recently. Whatever caused it, it left him paralyzed in the back. But he's strong, really strong, and he's been trying to survive on front legs alone. That's remarkable. Mason looked at the dog again. Ranger met his eyes, calm as ever, and touched his nose lightly to Mason's wrist, a silent gesture that felt like trust. "What now?" Mason asked. "He'll need long-term care," Dr. Keating replied. "Someone patient, someone strong enough to help him relearn how to live." Mason didn't hesitate. "I'll take him." Dr. Keating studied him, his tired face, the grief tucked behind his eyes, the way his hand rested protectively near the dog. She nodded gently. "Then he's yours." Mason exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Ranger," he said softly, testing the name as if offering it rather than imposing it. "Your name's Ranger now. You're safe." Ranger blinked, ears tilting faintly forward. His tail didn't move, couldn't move, but something shifted in his expression. Acceptance, perhaps. Or relief. Outside, the sky had darkened further, snow thickening like a curtain closing over the first act of a long winter tale. Mason wrapped Ranger carefully in a warm blanket and carried him back to the truck. As he settled the dog in, he felt the quiet weight of something new forming, a bond, tentative but real, the kind that arrives not with fireworks, but with a gentle nudge in the heart on the coldest night of the year. Ash Falls, wrapped in its winter silence, seemed to watch as Mason drove home with his unexpected companion. And though neither of them knew it yet, this moment, the rescue on the highway, the meeting in the storm, would become the beginning of a story that would change them both, a story woven by loss, kindness, and the strange miracles that winter sometimes carries. Snowfall thickened over Ash Falls as if the heavens were pouring out everything they had withheld for years. Flakes drifted in slow spirals, catching the faint orange glow of the street lamps and turning the air into a swirling field of pale embers. Mason Hale drove through the storm, with Ranger resting quietly in the back seat, wrapped in a layered blanket that smelled faintly of pine and old cotton. The warmth inside the truck fought against the cold outside, but not nearly enough for comfort. Winter had a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks, reminding the town, and every soul within it, how small they truly were. Mason's cabin stood on the edge of the forest, a sturdy wooden structure with a pitched roof and a porch that creaked when the wind blew too hard. It had once been a place of laughter and soft lights, a home filled with warm dinners and the gentle voice of his late wife, Elena. Elena had been 38 when she passed, a bright, warm-hearted woman with honey blonde hair, a narrow figure softened by kindness, and brown eyes that could coax a smile from even the most withdrawn stranger. She worked as the elementary school's reading specialist, known for leaving handwritten encouragement notes for her students, each decorated with tiny doodles of stars. After her death, the cabin had seemed to shrink around Mason, as if the walls themselves mourned with him. Tonight, as he carried Ranger inside, the cabin felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, just less empty. Ranger weighed more than his fragile state suggested, and Mason had to shift his grip lightly to avoid stressing the dog's spine. Inside, the air held the faint smell of cedar wood and old books. The living room contained a worn leather couch, a stone fireplace, and a quilt folded neatly on the armrest, the quilt Elena had sewn during their first winter here. Mason looked at it briefly, a flicker of memory passing through his mind, but he pushed the emotion aside. Ranger needed him. He laid Ranger on a padded dog bed near the fireplace, lined with soft blankets. The dog watched him silently, ears relaxed, eyes reflecting the light of the fire that Mason finally kindled. Flames crackled upward, breathing warmth into the room. Mason sat beside Ranger, running a hand carefully over the dog's head. "Welcome home," he murmured, his voice almost fragile. Ranger blinked slowly and pressed his nose into Mason's palm, an instinctive response, gentle and grounding. As if he already understood, Mason carried a wound of his own. Storm winds swept against the windows as evening deepened. Mason prepared a simple meal, soup for himself, soft food mixed with warm broth for Ranger. Ranger ate slowly but gratefully, tail barely shifting from its stillness. Then Mason administered the medication Dr. Keating provided, massaging Ranger's shoulders and inspecting the dog's paws for lingering frostbite. Hours passed quietly. The storm grew harsher, rattling the walls and dimming the world outside into obscurity. Mason dozed for a moment on the couch, exhaustion tugging at his eyelids. But sleep, for him, was rarely the refuge it should have been. It wasn't long before the nightmare swept in. Swift, sharp, and unavoidable. He heard again the screech of tires on ice, the metal shriek of colliding vehicles, the breaking of glass. In the dream, he was back on the roadside 3 years ago, kneeling beside Elena's crushed car, her hand slipping from his grip. He heard her voice calling his name, or maybe he imagined it. He never knew anymore. And then there was only silence, the kind that made the world feel as if it had ended. Mason shot awake with a choked breath, heart pounding, sweat cold against his skin. He braced himself with one hand on the couch, the other trembling uncontrollably. His eyes darted around the room, trying to anchor himself, but the storm outside only amplified the echo of his own fear. PTSD came like this sometimes, like a fist to the chest, sudden and merciless. He closed his eyes, jaw clenched, breath stuttering. That's when he felt it, a soft pressure against his leg. Ranger had dragged himself across the wooden floor, using only his front legs, each movement slow and strenuous. His chest rose and fell with effort, the friction of the floor scraping lightly against his fur. But he kept moving until he reached Mason's side and nudged the deputy's hand with his nose. Mason opened his eyes and looked down. Ranger gazed back at him with the deep, steady calm of a creature who understood suffering too intimately. His eyes held a quiet message. I'm here. Not dramatic, not miraculous, just present. Just enough. Mason's breathing steadied, inch by inch. He lowered his hand to rest atop Ranger's head. You shouldn't be moving that much, he whispered shakily, but there was no reprimand in his voice, only gratitude wrapped in weariness. Ranger laid his head on Mason's knee, sighing softly. The fire crackled, the storm howled, and for the first time in years, the crushing weight in Mason's chest eased, only slightly, but enough to remind him what warmth felt like. Mason lifted Ranger gently and carried him back to the bed near the fire. He sat beside him again, this time remaining awake, stroking the dog's fur with long, steady motions. Morning crept slowly into Ash Falls. The sky softened from charcoal to muted gray, revealing snow piled high against the porch rails. Mason brewed coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. Ranger watched him from his bed, ears twitching lightly whenever Mason glanced his way. While Mason prepared Ranger's morning meal, a knock sounded at the cabin door, 2 quick taps followed by a hesitant third. Mason opened it to find Mrs. Canterley, a neighbor in her late 60s. She was small-boned and wiry, always bundled in oversized sweaters she knitted herself. Her curly white hair framed her face like a drifting cloud, and her keen blue eyes missed nothing. She was known in town for her strong opinions, sharp tongue, and secretly generous heart, though she tried her best to pretend otherwise. "I heard you brought home a dog," she said without preamble. "I have leftover stew. Thought you might want some. You forget to eat when you're stressed." Mason blinked. Mrs. Canterley always had a way of speaking that made him feel transparent. "Thank you," he said, accepting the dish. She leaned slightly to look inside and caught sight of Ranger resting near the fire. Her expression softened noticeably, though she immediately masked it with a small huff. "Poor thing," she murmured. "Looks like he's seen more winters than any of us." Then her eyes sharpened suspiciously. "Is he dangerous?" "No," Mason answered simply. "Just hurt." Mrs. Canterley studied him a moment, gauging whether she believed him, then nodded curtly. "Good. Injured creatures deserve protection, not fear. You need anything, just holler." She turned and trudged back through the snow, disappearing into the white. Mason closed the door and carried the stew into the kitchen. As he took a bite, he realized Ranger was watching him with quiet curiosity, his ears perked forward. Mason chuckled softly. "I'll bet you had someone who loved you too," he whispered. The hours passed peacefully. Mason tended to Ranger's care instructions, medication, grooming, gentle repositioning to prevent pressure sores. Ranger responded with calm patience, his gaze following Mason wherever he went. Outside, the storm eased into a steady snowfall, coating the cabin windows with delicate patterns like feathers pressed against glass. But peace never lasted long in small towns. By late afternoon, rumors had begun to thread through Ash Falls. Mason received the first message from his deputy partner, Owen Reddick, a 35-year-old officer with sandy brown hair, a lean build, and a habit of over-worrying. Owen was friendly, dependable, and capable, though sometimes easily rattled by the tension of small-town gossip. "Mason, people are talking. A kid got scratched up outside the old grain shop this morning. Some folks are already saying your dog might have done it." Mason stared at the message, disbelief tightening in his chest. Ranger could barely drag himself across the floor. How could he harm anyone? He typed back, "Ranger didn't do it." Minutes later, another message. "I know, but rumors spread fast. Be ready." Mason glanced at Ranger, who was dozing lightly, chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic breaths. The dog looked impossibly peaceful, a creature incapable of malice. Mason frowned. Anger was rare for him these days, dulled by grief. But something protective flared beneath his ribs. He reached out and placed a hand gently on Ranger's shoulder. "They don't know you," he whispered. "But I do." Snow fell harder. The wind shifted, and though neither Mason nor Ranger realized it, the small storm of rumor outside was only the beginning of the challenges ahead. Ash Falls had never been a town of loud voices or quick tempers. Most days, its people moved like the snowfall, slow, steady, shaped by routine and simple expectations. But rumors, like winter winds, had a talent for slipping into every crack, and in small mountain towns. Once a whisper found its way in, it grew teeth. By the end of the week, the story of a dangerous crippled dog had already made its rounds, shifting shape each time it passed between worried lips. Ranger lay quietly near the fireplace in Mason's cabin, unaware of the voices outside, unaware of the way people looked at Mason in the grocery store or how conversations stopped when he entered a room. The dog had only one reality: the steady presence of the man who had given him warmth, food, and a name. But Mason felt the town tilting. Each shift of public opinion, small, quiet, subtle, felt like the deep groaning of ice cracking beneath his feet. The letter from the town council arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by Deputy Owen Reddick. The younger man stepped inside with snow melting from his jacket and an apologetic tightness around his mouth. Owen was dependable, jut-jawed, thin but quick on his feet, with an earnestness that almost made him appear younger than his 35 years. He disliked confrontation, disliked upsetting anyone, and nothing upset towns more than uncertainty. "It's not an accusation," Owen said quickly, handing Mason the folded paper. "They just want clarity." Mason read the short notice. "A community meeting. Tonight. Discussion regarding a potential safety matter involving a newly rescued canine." Ranger lifted his head as Mason lowered the paper. His amber eyes met Mason's, calm and soft, unaware of the weight pressing on the deputy's shoulders. "You didn't hurt anyone," Mason whispered. Ranger's ears twitched faintly, as if acknowledging the truth of it. The Ash Falls Community Hall stood at the center of town like an old wooden guardian, its wide beams weathered by decades of storms, graduations, barn dances, and elections. Tonight, lanterns glowed behind frosted windows, casting warm light on the snowdrifts piled outside. Cars lined the narrow streets. People trudged toward the entrance, their boots crunching through snow, their breaths forming fleeting clouds. Inside, the hall hummed with conversation, some curious, some anxious, some teetering toward anger. Mason walked in with Ranger cradled in his arms, the dog wrapped in a thick blanket. The moment he entered, dozens of heads turned. The chatter dimmed, replaced by a thick, weighted silence. Ranger tucked his chin closer to Mason's chest, sensing the tension. Mason kept his face steady, his footsteps measured. He placed Ranger gently on a cushioned mat near his seat. Ranger lay still, gaze lowered but attentive, his crippled hind legs tucked awkwardly, the blanket covering most of his frame. At the front of the hall, Councilman Robert Winley cleared his throat. Winley was in his early 60s, thin, pale, and always impeccably dressed, with the stern manner of a man who believed rules should never bend. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here tonight to discuss an incident involving a child who was found with scratches on his arm." A murmur moved through the crowd. Mason folded his arms, jaw tight. Winley continued. "Some residents expressed concern that the new dog Deputy Hale rescued. He has a name," Mason said, voice low but carrying. "Ranger." A few townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Winley adjusted his glasses. "Yes, Ranger." Concerns were raised that he may have been involved. "He can't walk," someone whispered. "How would he attack a child?" "That's what we're here to determine," Winley replied. "We have the boy's grandparents here, and they've brought a video clip from their porch camera." A projector clicked on. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up with snowy footage, grainy but clear enough to make out shapes. A small figure, a boy bundled in a red winter coat, was struggling with someone taller, a stranger, face obscured, tugging at his arm. A gasp rippled through the hall. Then, in the corner of the frame, a shape appeared, dragging, determined. Ranger. The dog moved using only his front legs, his body trembling from exertion. He barked, sharp and forceful, the sound distorted by the wind captured in the recording. The stranger jerked backward, startled, then released the boy and fled out of frame. The boy stumbled, tripped, and fell onto the icy porch. His hands scraped across the wooden boards, likely causing the injuries earlier mistaken for bites. Ranger inched toward him, sniffed him, circled protectively, and barked again toward the direction the stranger had run. The video ended. Silence swept through the hall, long, stunned, heavy. A woman near the front put her hand over her mouth. "Oh my heavens, he saved him." Someone else whispered, "We judged too fast." Councilman Winley shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing the situation had been less stark. "Well, that clarifies the matter." Mason exhaled slowly. The knot in his chest loosened. Ranger looked up, sensing the shift in the crowd's energy, his ears lifting slightly. But the night was far from over. A teenage voice from the back yelled out, "What about the fire behind the shelter last night?" Heads turned. "My cousin said they saw that crippled dog near the fence earlier that day. How do we know he didn't cause something else?" "It was arson," someone countered. "A dog can't start a fire." "Maybe he ran off those guys," another teen said, defensive but unsure. "Or maybe he—" Mason stood, cutting through the rising noise. Ranger didn't start any fire. Before Winley could regain control of the hall, the back doors burst open. A firefighter rushed in, heavy coat, frost in his beard, breath fast with urgency. His name was Lucas Garrison, a tall man in his 40s with a broad chest and gentle, steady eyes. "We found something," he said loudly. "The fire at the shelter? It wasn't an accident. Someone used accelerants, and there are still animals trapped in the back storage area. The fire's spreading again." Fear seized the room. "Some of those animals can't walk," Lucas added. "If anyone can help, now's the time." Mason's mind snapped into focus. Duty came first. Lives came first. He lifted Ranger into his arms again. The dog whined softly, sensing urgency. "I'm going," Mason said. "Someone call Dr. Keating. We'll need her there." Teenagers, parents, neighbors, they all moved, scrambling to gather coats and boots. Snow blew in through the open doors, swirling like frantic spirits. The meeting dissolved into action, not through debate, but through necessity. As Mason carried Ranger out into the freezing night, the wind cutting across his face, he felt the familiar surge he once felt on duty calls, a blaze of purpose, anchored by the weight of the dog he held. The fire's orange glow rose beyond the tree line, flickering like a warning. Ranger lifted his head toward the light, ears stiff, eyes sharp. It was as though the dog understood that tonight, his truth had been shown, his innocence recognized, but another challenge waited just beyond the next gust of winter wind. Mason tightened his grip. "We'll get them out, buddy." The storm howled, sirens wailed, and together, man and dog, they disappeared into the snow-carved darkness toward the burning shelter. Snow hammered the ground as Mason Hale drove toward the burning shelter, the patrol truck skidding slightly on ice-crusted roads. The smoke rising beyond the trees was a dark, trembling column, its edges illuminated by orange flames that pulsed like the heartbeat of something alive. Ranger lay wrapped in blankets on the passenger seat, his chest rising quickly, ears alert despite the trembling in his limbs. Though he could not stand, there was a fierce awareness in his eyes, the kind of readiness found in creatures who understand danger long before humans do. As the truck turned the last corner, the sight struck Mason's chest like a physical blow. The back storage building of the Ash Falls Animal Haven was engulfed in flames, the fire climbing up the wooden siding, spitting embers into the swirling snow that melted instantly upon contact. The main shelter building was untouched for now, but the storage area, converted into a temporary holding space for injured animals, was burning too quickly for comfort. Dozens of townspeople were already there, silhouettes moving frantically against the fire's glow. Firefighters shouted instructions, axes in hand, hoses spraying arcs of freezing water that hissed as they met the flames. The cold wind scattered sparks unpredictably, making the fire behave like something wild and stubborn. Mason stepped out of the truck, lifting Ranger into his arms. The blast of heat from the flames slapped his face instantly, sweat mixing with snow on his brow. Ranger whined softly, not out of fear, but urgency, a trembling sound that carried warning, insistence. Lucas Garrison, the firefighter who rushed into the meeting, ran up to Mason. His face was red from heat, beard wet with melted snow. "We've gotten most of the animals from the main unit," he shouted over the crackling roar. "But the storage building! There's a section in the back we can't reach. Smoke's too thick, and part of the ceiling collapsed. There might still be animals trapped." "How many?" Mason asked, voice tight. 3 dogs, maybe more, and a crate of cats that was moved for insulation repairs. Lucas cursed under his breath. "We didn't know anyone would relight this damn fire." Mason felt anger simmer beneath his ribs. Not blind rage, but something focused, sharp. Someone had done this. Someone who didn't care about the lives inside. But anger wouldn't save anyone now. He set Ranger gently on a snowbank near the truck. "Stay here," Mason said, though both of them knew Ranger never simply stayed where he was told. "I'll help get everyone out." The moment Mason turned toward the shelter, a piercing, frantic cascade of barks erupted behind him. Ranger, despite the burning cold on his paws and the uselessness of his hind legs, was dragging himself across the snow toward the building, front legs digging into the slush, muscles trembling from effort. "Ranger!" Mason rushed back, lifting this dog into his arms again. Ranger barked once, loud, sharp, commanding. Not panic. A signal. Lucas stared. "He knows something," he murmured. "Dogs always know." A firefighter sprinted by and shouted. The old fire bell's still mounted inside the storage entrance. If we can get it ringing, backup crews from North Valley might hear it. They're monitoring for alarms, but our power connection's down. Mason turned sharply. "Where's the bell?" "Inside the side corridor, left wall, but the smoke's too thick for us to get there right now." Ranger barked again, struggling in Mason's arms. His front paws pushed forward in the air, reaching for the building. And that was the moment Mason understood. Ranger wasn't trying to enter the flames. He was trying to reach the bell. Mason sprinted to the side corridor. The entrance door was cracked, black smoke seeping out like a slow exhale from a wounded beast. He covered his nose and mouth with his sleeve, turned his head, and kicked the weakened bottom panel open. The corridor was dim, orange flickers crawling along the ceiling as smoke churned in choking gray waves. Heat slapped Mason's face, forcing his eyes to squint. He couldn't go far, not without gear, but maybe far enough. 10 feet in, hanging crookedly on its rusted mount, was the fire bell, a large metal ring with a rope hanging from its base. And by some miracle of wind or disrepair, the rope had fallen low, dragging along the floor where even a child or a crawling dog could reach it. Ranger twisted in Mason's grip again, barking into the smoke-filled hallway. "You want to try?" Mason asked, realization dawning. Ranger made a small, determined chirp, a sound Mason had never heard from him before, but one that carried unmistakable resolve. Mason crouched low, placing Ranger gently on the floor just inside the doorway, where the air was still breathable. "Don't go farther than this," Mason whispered, begging more than commanding. "Please." Ranger looked up, eyes burning with clear purpose, then lowered himself to the ground and began pulling forward using only his front legs. His claws scraped against the floor, muscles straining, body trembling with the effort. The corridor's smoke stung his eyes, but he didn't stop. 5 feet, 6, 7. For a moment, Mason thought Ranger wouldn't make it. His body shook, the weight of his paralyzed hind legs dragging him. But Ranger paused, took a shuddering breath, and pushed forward again. When he reached the rope, he lifted his head, opened his mouth, and clamped down on it. The first pull was weak. The second, stronger. The third, clang. The bell rang, a deep metallic cry that echoed down the corridor, through the shattered windows, across the snowy yard. Firefighters turned toward the sound. People paused, breath held. Ranger pulled again. Clang, clang, clang. The sound ripped through the storm, louder than the wind, louder than fear. And from the direction of the road, a faint reply rose, the sirens of North Valley's backup crew answering the call. "He did it," Lucas whispered. "Ranger did it." But Ranger was collapsing. The smoke was too thick now. Mason sprinted forward, grabbed the dog, and rushed back into the fresh air. Ranger coughed weakly, body limp. Mason held him close, pressing his face to the dog's head. "You're okay," he whispered, voice cracking. "You're okay, buddy." Minutes later, though they felt like a lifetime, the backup engines roared in, water cannons blasting the burning lumber, firefighters swarming in waves. With the reinforced team, they reached the back room at last, uncovering 3 trembling dogs and a cluster of cats huddled inside a fallen crate, all alive. Cheers rose, scattered but heartfelt. But Ranger lay motionless in Mason's arms, exhausted beyond measure. His breathing was shallow, his paws streaked with soot. Mason knelt in the snow, shielding the dog from the wind. "You saved them," he whispered. "Every one of them. You rang that bell." Dr. Linda Keating rushed over, medical bag in hand. Her face blanched when she saw Ranger's condition. "Smoke inhalation, severe fatigue. He needs oxygen support, now." They placed Ranger on a stretcher, moving quickly to the vet ambulance that had arrived with the backup crew. Mason followed them, his boots sinking into fresh snow, heart pounding with fear and admiration tangled together. Inside the mobile clinic, as the machine hissed oxygen gently toward Ranger's muzzle, there was a moment, small, fragile, when Ranger's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Mason and gave the faintest wag of his tail. Barely there, but real. Then his eyes closed again, trusting the world to hold him. Outside, the fire was dying. The shelter animals were safe. The townspeople were gathered together, their faces lit by a mix of relief and awe, and Mason realized something unexpected. Tonight, Ranger had saved more than just animals. He had saved the heart of a town that had almost forgotten how to believe. Winter did not loosen its grip after the fire. If anything, Ash Falls seemed to fall deeper into the cold, as if the season itself had paused to watch over the fragile life of the dog that had saved so many. The sky remained a quiet gray quilt, heavy with unmoving clouds. Snow piled high along the fences, thick and muffled like wool draped across the town. In the veterinary emergency room, the world was small. Soft lights, steady beeps, the faint hum of an oxygen machine. Ranger lay on a padded cot, his chest wrapped in warmed blankets, a small tube delivering gentle breaths of enriched air. His fur smelled faintly of smoke despite repeated washings, and every now and then a twitch passed through his paws as though the memory of the fire still lived in his muscles. Mason sat beside him, unmoving, shoulders rounded in worry. The lines under his eyes deepened from days of sleeplessness, his stubble thickening across his jaw. He didn't speak except to whisper encouragements now and then, words not meant to fill the silence, but to remind Ranger he wasn't alone in it. Dr. Linda Keating had been the picture of steadfast determination. She checked on Ranger every hour, adjusting medication, monitoring oxygen levels, and asking volunteers to help keep him warm. Her own exhaustion hid beneath professionalism, though her eyes softened every time she looked at the dog. "He's a fighter," she told Mason more than once. "But he needs time, a lot of it." Time. The strange currency Mason had learned to respect since losing Elena. Some things healed, some didn't. He never knew which category he fell into, only that the act of waiting felt like a test he never truly passed. But Ranger kept breathing, slow, steady, present. By the third day, Ranger's eyes opened fully, groggy, glassy, but alive. When he saw Mason sitting beside him, Ranger lifted his head a mere inch, touched the deputy's hand with his nose, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. Mason swallowed hard. "You scared the hell out of us," he whispered. Ranger blinked once, as if apologizing. Word spread through Ash Falls like warmth through cold rooms. People began dropping off blankets, toys, handmade cards from children, all addressed to Ranger. Children drew pictures of him with wheels instead of legs, pulling heroic expressions as he saved kittens from fires. Elderly residents knitted scarves with Ranger's name stitched into the ends. Someone anonymously paid all his medical expenses. And a curious thing happened. The town, once divided in their fear and judgment, now found unity in gratitude. Ranger's recovery was slow. Smoke inhalation had weakened him badly, and his muscles, especially those along his unused hindquarters, felt drained of strength. Mason visited him at dawn and at dusk, sometimes reading aloud from old books, sometimes simply sitting quietly beside him while Ranger slept. Weeks passed. Snow fell often, piling against windowsills and burying rooftops, but inside the clinic, Ranger gained strength piece by piece. His breathing improved, his appetite returned. He lifted himself on his front paws again. The spark in his eyes, the one that had survived storms, abandonment, and fire, glowed brighter. The day he was deemed stable enough to return home, volunteers lined the walkway outside the clinic, waving as Mason carried Ranger carefully to the truck. Some clapped, some smiled through tears. Ranger lifted his head to each sound, tail twitching faintly against the blanket. "He really is our little miracle," an elderly woman whispered. "Not little," her husband corrected. "He's a lion disguised as a dog." Back at the cabin, Mason set up a recovery corner near the fireplace. Soft mats, warm blankets, fresh water, and gentle toys. Ranger settled easily into it, as if knowing this place was carved out for him. But rehabilitation was long. Ranger's body bore the lasting truth of his spinal injury. His hind legs remained still as fallen branches. Only his front legs carried him. Every small movement across the wooden floor was an effort that trembled through his shoulders. Mason followed every instruction from Dr. Keating: gentle massage sessions, warm compresses, careful repositioning. Ranger accepted each with patience, though sometimes his breath came in tiny huffs of discomfort. Children from the town visited often, bringing handmade treats, drawings, or just their laughter. Ranger's ears perked every time he heard their footsteps. Some adults visited too, Firefighters, shelter volunteers, even the grandparents of the rescued boy. They knelt beside Ranger, thanked him softly, sometimes touching his fur with reverence. But it was Tom Barrick, the town's metal worker, who brought the biggest change. Tom was in his late 50s, burly, with soot permanently smudged into the lines of his hands. He was a quiet man, known for fixing farm tools, welding old machinery, and crafting metal sculptures that dotted the gardens of Ash Falls. When he arrived at Mason's cabin, he carried a canvas-covered frame under one arm. "I heard about the dog," Tom said, cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Thought I could help." He gently removed the canvas, revealing a custom-built wheelchair for dogs. Lightweight aluminum wheels, padded harnesses, adjustable bars. Simple, strong, made with meticulous care. "For him," Tom said gruffly, nodding toward Ranger. Mason felt something catch in his throat. "You didn't have to." Tom cut him off with a shrug. "Town owes him more than this, and, well, fixing things is what I do." They fitted the wheelchair around Ranger carefully. The dog trembled slightly, unsure. Mason crouched beside him, whispering, "It's okay. It's here to help you." Ranger pushed forward once, too hard, and toppled sideways into the snow outside the cabin. Children gasped. Mason moved to lift him, but Ranger shook his head, barking softly as if insisting on trying again. Attempt 2, another stumble. Attempt 3, wheels shifted but didn't roll. Attempt 4, one wheel caught a patch of ice and spun, spraying flakes. Attempt 5, Ranger paused, panting, eyes focused. Attempt 6, he surged forward, and this time the wheels turned. Just an inch, then 2, then a full glorious foot of movement. Children erupted in cheers. Tom wiped his eyes discreetly with the back of his glove. Mason laughed, a rare sound that felt like something thawing deep in his chest. Ranger barked once, bright and triumphant, his tail thumping against the harness. From that moment on, the wheelchair didn't just give him mobility, it gave him purpose again. News traveled beyond Ash Falls. A small local reporter visited, filming a short segment for the Everyday Heroes program. They interviewed Mason briefly, but the true star was Ranger, rolling gently across the snowy lot, stopping politely whenever a child asked to pet him. The segment aired across the state. 3 days later, the phone rang at the vet clinic. It was a caregiver from Maplewood Senior Home in Northridge Valley, a woman named Sandra Doyle, kind-voiced, middle-aged, with a calm patience worn into her tone. She spoke softly but urgently. "I think I know that dog. We had a resident years ago, Eleanor Briggs. She had a service dog named Axel. He went missing during a storm when she was transferred for emergency care. She never stopped talking about him. I saw your broadcast. And the scars, the eyes. God, I think that's him." They arranged the meeting 2 days later. Eleanor Briggs was 82, thin and delicate, with soft silver hair pulled into a bun and hands that trembled when she held them up. She had once been a battlefield nurse, carrying heavy memories with a grace shaped by years of effort. Her eyes, pale blue, slightly clouded with age, were sharp with longing when she entered the clinic. When she saw Ranger, she froze. Her breath caught. Her gloved hand lifted to her mouth. "Axel," she whispered, voice breaking like thawing ice. "Oh, my brave boy. Is it really you?" Ranger turned his head, ears pricking. A strange emotional sound escaped him. Half whine, half chirp. Mason unbuckled the wheelchair harness, allowing Ranger to move freely. The dog dragged himself toward her with surprising strength, stopping at her feet and pressing his head against her trembling hands. Eleanor knelt with effort, tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered, "I lost you. I thought I lost you forever." Ranger licked her wrist gently. A bond, once severed by storm and time, repaired itself in a single breath. It was reunion born from winter miracles, the kind Ash Falls would speak of for years. And as Eleanor cried into Ranger's fur, Mason felt something shift inside him too. Something healing. Something opening. The dog he saved it saved so many others, but perhaps, without realizing it, Ranger had saved him as well. Winter's last month settled over Ash Falls with a kind of quiet majesty, as though the season had chosen to linger just a bit longer for reasons only the mountains understood. The snow on the rooftops gleamed with a faint blue sheen in the morning light, and the air carried that crisp, ethereal stillness that made every sound, every footstep, every breath feel sacred. This year, the annual first snow parade, usually a small affair of lanterns, wreaths, and children bundled in bright scarves, was different. Whisper it anywhere in town, and people would smile with a warmth that defied the cold. It was not the parade that made the season special. It was the guest of honor, Ranger, the dog who saved a boy, saved a shelter, saved a town from its own fear. The dog who had crawled through storms and smoke, who had rung a bell when no human could reach it. The dog who had survived against the kind of odds that humbled even the bravest. Preparations filled the streets for days. Volunteers strung soft golden lights along the lampposts, each bulb glowing like a tiny ember. Children practiced their chants, their mittens flailing as they rehearsed what banners they would carry. Shop owners placed handmade wooden cutouts of German shepherd silhouettes in their windows. Even the fire department polished its engines to a shine that rivaled the snow. On the morning of the parade, Mason Hale stood in his cabin doorway, fastening Ranger's wheelchair harness with practiced hands. Ranger's fur had been brushed to a warm golden sheen, the darker saddle along his back gleaming under the morning light. The marks of his struggles, faint lines from surgery, softened patches of fur where bandages once lay, were still present, quiet reminders of the path he had taken. Ranger was a little over 3 years old now, full-bodied in the chest, strong in the forelegs, with deep amber eyes that carried both gentleness and an unbreakable resolve. As Mason lifted the last strap, Ranger nudged his hand, the dog's gaze warm with trust. It was a simple gesture, but it filled Mason with a sense of something whole, a piece of winter light settling into his chest. "You ready to lead the whole town?" Mason asked. Ranger barked softly, almost as if answering. Mason placed a scarf loosely around his neck, not for warmth, but because the children of Ash Falls had insisted he wear it. Small embroidered snowflakes dotted the fabric, and at one end, the word Ranger was stitched in crooked, loving letters. The truck ride into town was slow, the roads lined with residents waving as they passed. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked, eyes bright, wheels clicking lightly whenever the truck bounced. Mason couldn't help but smile. Ranger, once found nearly frozen on a roadside, now rode like a champion. When they arrived at the town square, a soft cheer rose from the gathered crowd. Lanterns lined the sidewalks, wreaths hung from windows, and strings of lights zigzagged across the street like constellations stitched between the buildings. The air carried the smell of cinnamon, pine, and fresh-baked bread, offerings from local vendors who set up stalls to keep the townsfolk warm. At the front row of the viewing area sat Eleanor Briggs, bundled in a thick wool coat. Her silver hair was braided neatly, her pale blue eyes bright as she watched every step Ranger made. Though she was 82, today she looked decades younger. Faces regain youth when joy takes hold of them. Her hands clutched a small handkerchief, trembling with anticipation. "Axel," she whispered softly, using Ranger's old name, the one she had given him when he was her service dog. "My brave boy." Ranger saw her, ears lifting, tail twitching. Mason brought him over, and Eleanor leaned forward, touching Ranger's cheek. Their reunion weeks ago had been emotional, but seeing him honored today brought new tears, ones of pride, not sorrow. "You shine brighter than the lights," she told him. Ranger licked her wrist gently, then returned to Mason's side as more people arrived. The parade began with the ringing of a small brass bell, clear, melodic, echoing through the snowy streets. Children marched first, carrying hand-painted signs. "Ranger saved us!" "The dog who never gave up." "He stood on love." Ranger rolled forward between Mason and two young firefighters, his wheels leaving faint trails in the snow. Each rotation of the wheels seemed to speak with its own rhythm, steady, strong, unwavering. The crowd clapped as he passed, their applause warm despite the cold. Mothers lifted their children so they could see better. Elderly residents leaned on canes or walkers, their eyes shining with the kind of hope that rarely belonged to winter. Teens who once whispered doubts about Ranger now held signs proclaiming him the hero of Ash Falls. At the mayor's podium, a short ceremony awaited. Mayor Evelyn Hart, a tall, dignified woman in her early 60s with tightly curled gray hair and a voice steady as bedrock, stepped forward. She had known the town through storms, through quiet years, through slow-changing seasons. "Citizens of Ash Falls," she began, her breath rising in soft clouds, "today we honor courage that did not come from strength of limb, but strength of heart. We honor a creature who, despite pain, despite injury, despite the coldest nights winter could offer, acted with more bravery than many of us ever will." She gestured toward Ranger. Ranger, the hero of Ash Falls. A wave of cheers erupted. Ranger's ears flicked, and he barked once, sharp, proud, humble. Mayor Hart continued, "This town has stood through many winters, but this winter taught us something new. It taught us that heroes can arrive in unexpected forms, and that hope, true hope, can roll forward on a pair of wheels when legs no longer can." She stepped aside, revealing a wooden sculpture at the back of the stage. It was a lifelike carving of Ranger, crafted by the town's woodcarver, smooth, snow-kissed grain capturing the dog's proud posture, his determined eyes, his wheels even more polished than the ones he wore now. At the base, words had been etched. He did not stand on legs, he stood on love. Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest as she read the inscription. Mason's throat tightened. Ranger stared at the statue, then looked to Mason, then to the crowd, as if understanding that the tribute wasn't just for him, but for everything he represented: endurance, kindness, second chances. The sun lowered beyond the mountains, turning the snow a glowing orange. Lanterns flickered on, one by one, their golden light blending with the first stars of twilight. Music began, soft violins, slow drums, the kind of melody that made hearts rise without effort. Ash Falls moved as one that night, neighbors clasping hands, strangers embracing, children laughing. Mason stood quietly beside Ranger, one hand resting on the dog's shoulders. He looked around, at Eleanor wiping happy tears, at the children chanting Ranger's name, at the townspeople holding candles against the growing dusk. For the first time in years, Mason felt something inside him settle. It wasn't healing, not fully, but it was the beginning of it. A thaw, slow but sure. Ranger nudged him, amber eyes shining. Mason knelt, pressing his forehead to Ranger's. "You saved so many," he whispered, "including me." Above them, snow fell gently, soft flakes drifting like blessings. And there, beneath the lantern-lit sky, the town celebrated not just a dog, but the reminder that even in the harshest winter, warmth can be born from the most unlikely places. Ranger, surrounded by love, rolled forward into the glow of lanterns and snow. A hero not standing on legs, but on the unshakable strength of his heart. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright signs. Sometimes they come quietly through a loyal dog who refuses to give up, through an officer who chooses compassion on a cold night, or through the strength God places in ordinary people when they feel they have nothing left. This story reminds us that even in the hardest winters of our lives, God walks beside us. He guides our steps, protects our families, and sends help in ways we often recognize only after the storm has passed. In our everyday lives, we all face moments of fear, loneliness, or uncertainty. Yet God works in the details, in a stranger who stops to help, in a small act of kindness we did not expect, in the courage we discover inside ourselves right when we need it most. When we choose hope, we open the door for His quiet miracles. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family with peace and protection wherever you are. And if you believe in the gentle miracles He sends, type Amen in the comments.